Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're very pleased to welcome you to Day 4 of the AI and Human Rights Forum. It's been an amazing event to discuss all sorts of aspects of how artificial intelligence is impacting human rights, where we have to look out for. We've been talking about disinformation, online hate, internet governance, and today we're really interested, we're very fortunate to have a very fascinating panel looking at how AI can be used to protect human rights defenders and those fleeing persecution. So I'd first like to thank our partners who have made this possible. We couldn't have done this without the support of Global Affairs Canada, with the government of Quebec, in particular the Ministry des Relations Internationales et la Francophonie. Also the Embassy of the Netherlands to Canada has been a partner, followed by the Canadian Commission to UNESCO. So I want to thank all our partners for making this happen, for allowing us to really create the top forum in Canada on human rights and AI, which is a growing area which needs more discussion, more focus, and more network building. So today, our final session of the forum is a fascinating one. It's called Exposing the Truth, Filmmaking, AI, and the Persecution of LGBTQ People in Chechnya. As you know, that in Chechnya, there's been enormous amounts of violence and threats against sexual minorities, and it's a part of the world that needs a lot more focus by governments to protect sexual minorities. So we're very fortunate to have us today. We have Rachel Pulfer, who is Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights. Thank you for joining us, Rachel. And then we'll be followed by three very different people with different perspectives on this, but we have David France, who's the Director of Welcome to Chechnya. We shared with everyone in the forum the trailer for that film. We have Sam Gregory, who's a Program Director at Witness. And we have Kimahli Powell, who's Executive Director of Rainbow Railroad. So with that being said, I'd like to pass the floor to Rachel to moderate the session. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a real privilege to be here and to be speaking about this incredibly challenging, difficult situation in Chechnya that frankly not enough people in this part of the world are aware of. The magnitude of the human rights abuses going on against sexual minorities there is truly appalling. And I hope that if you haven't already, please, after this session, take a look at the film Welcome to Chechnya. It is shocking, it is powerful, and it will, I think, help to focus more of our international community's attention on this issue in a way that is urgently needed still. And we'll hear more about that shortly. It's my privilege to moderate this conversation today. And the first speaker is the filmmaker, the director of Welcome to Chechnya himself, David France, who's coming into this conversation from his home in the East Village in New York City. And I'm wondering, David, if you could share with us a few thoughts, initially introductory thoughts about the making of the film, why it was so important for you to make this film, and then we'll get into some of the more technical aspects related to your use of AI. And you're on mute.
Off mute now. Thank you, Rachel and Kyle, for that introduction, and I'm glad to be with you today. I am an investigative reporter and have been for many years. And when I read about the work that was being done in Chechnya and in Russia by ordinary citizens, really, to try to counter this persecution and genocidal campaign in Chechnya, that's when I felt compelled to take on this story and try and bring some world attention to the work that was being taken on at such incredible personal risk. And so that's what really called me into action. The story broke about what was happening there in early 2017. Headlines did circle the globe. And as you pointed out, the news media went remarkably silent, at least certainly in North America and elsewhere. And that left this kind of, political opening for the leadership in Chechnya to continue their campaign. And it is a government coordinated, orchestrated campaign to round up and eliminate the LGBTQ community in Chechnya. And that's why it's such a horror that to be carrying this story forward, it's so important that people understand this is going on in today's world, and so that's what I wanted to try to do, is lift up the stories of the people who are doing that work, lift up the stories of the people who had survived that campaign, and carry them to a larger audience.
Well, you certainly do so very powerfully and effectively in the film, and the extent of the coordination and the orchestration of this campaign is extremely evident, as well as some harrowing scenes documenting what has been happening to the LGBTQ minority in Chechnya and continues to happen now, which is, I think, the key point to stress the urgency of this issue. I'm going to ask Kimahli now to share a little bit about Rainbow Railroad's work in the region. And just, I know you just came from a UN panel, and if you can just share a little bit about how Rainbow Railroad got involved, and perhaps also how Canadians can better support that effort.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. And I want to also second Rachel, encouraging folks to see this really important film. My name is Kimahli Powell. I'm the executive director at Rainbow Railroad. I use he, him, and his pronouns. And Rainbow Railroad as an organization that based in Canada, but also works out of the United States, whose focus is to provide pathways to safety for LGBTQI+ persons facing persecution. It feels for me in our work just common knowledge, but it still shocks many people to understand that there are still 70 countries that criminalize same-sex intimacy. And that means that many people end up being displaced. And also, at the same time, we are facing a global migration crisis with about 80 million displaced people, the highest number since World War II. And what that happens, the intersection of those two crises means that LGBTQI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and intersex folks often becomes victims and targets of state-sponsored violence. And although our ultimate goal is to get better and decriminalize these laws and policies, we're seeing a hard pushback in these countries, like in Chechnya. And so our work is obviously to support a future where people can live where they can free of persecution. But unfortunately, there are moments like the situation in Chechnya where governments swiftly round up persons to torture, humiliate, persecute, and ultimately harm and perpetuate violence, including murder on folks. In this particular instance, our work means amplifying and working with human rights defenders on the ground. The film highlights our remarkable friends at the Russian LGBT Network and the Moscow LGBT Center to find pathways to safety. We've helped over 1,000 people relocate to multiple countries, and we were honored to play a part in amplifying that organization's efforts to help people escape.
It's amazing. 1,000 people. Wow. That's very powerful work. Thank you for sharing. Sam, Gregory, Program Director at Witness, can you give us a sense of your thoughts from where you sit about the importance of the work that David has done in a slightly more global context of how AI can be used, in this case, for good, to help to protect people whose stories need to get out, but there is enormous personal risk to being identified in the process of that storytelling.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This film is a tremendous film. We had the chance to interview David for an interview series we did last autumn and really learn about the project. The film really brings together three strands of important issues that are highly relevant to Witness. For those who don't know Witness, we're a human rights organization that helps people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. And very central to that is, how do you document and share both the evidence of violations, but also testimony in a way that helps address human rights violations, but also protects people. And what we've seen is, of course, over the past years, a huge proliferation of people doing this, both in documentary form, but also in citizen footage, and perennially facing the trade-offs of how to do this in a way that both humanizes and protects the integrity of the testimony, but also does not raise the risks. And this happens in every context, from police violence, for example, in the last year around the world in the aftermath of protests against racial injustice and structural racism, happens in war crimes, and it happens against minorities like LGBTQI plus people. And we've done work in Chechnya in the past and really seen the challenges of this. The second strand it really brings up for us is something we've worked on for many years, which is the question of how do you protect visual anonymity, right? We live in an increasingly visual world where it's not just okay, and you may not get attention if you just share things in text. At the same time, our face is virtually the most identifiable part of us. It's a face print that facial recognition and face matching can turn into our identity. So for the past decade, we've worked on tools for blurring. We built the first tool to do blurring on mobile phones called ObscuraCam with a group called the Guardian Project, and we worked to get YouTube to build in a blurring tool. But those tools blur the faces and they destroy that sense of connection and humanity. So we have a real interest in how do we do this in a way that preserves people's integrity and humanity. And I think that's something that we can talk about in this film. And then the final area, and you raised this, is we spent the last 3 years really thinking about the emerging area of deepfakes and other synthetic media that allow you to create more realistic representations of real people or forgeries. And we spent the last 3 years in a series of consultations globally, really hearing what people worry about, what they want from that, and what they also see as deepfakes for good. And I know David doesn't like the phrase deepfakes, and I don't think it is a good phrase to use about this film. But this idea of actually, are there positive ways we can use this ability to swap faces? And Welcome to Chechnya is such a inspiring model of using deepfakes for good rather than the ways we've heard globally about how they're being used, for example, to target women with non-consensual sexual images or to create falsified scenarios for business or politics.
Lots to unpack, and we'll get into more of that later in the conversation. I'd like to ask David, coming back to your use of AI in this film, how did you arrive at the decision to use AI in the way that you did? And what was the process that you undertook in order to make the film as seamless as it is when you experience it?
My pathway to this solution was much as Sam was describing. I wanted to be able to promise people who could not be seen in the film that I would disguise them to what we were calling the highest standard, which was that even their own mothers wouldn't recognize them in the film. And I had never approached that challenge before. So I returned with footage to the studio and began experimenting with the tools that people had used in the past, you know, the blurring and the pixelating and the and all of that, as Sam mentions, is really reduces the humanity of the individuals who are in the film, and it pushes away a feeling of connectedness and a feeling of journey that that I knew I was experiencing, having witnessed what these incredible brave people were doing. If I was trying to find a way to present it so that an audience could also experience that and be kind of called to some sort of emotional action by the experience of the film. The toolbox for documentary filmmakers was not very rich with options. So I tried rendering the individuals as cartoons within the frame through something called rotographics, which is a device that's been used in other movies like Scanner Darkly and films like that. It didn't disguise. It just rendered people kind of two-dimensional. I put those two-dimensional images then through filters to stretch faces, and you know, it really just tended to make people look even more like themselves, kind of caricatures of themselves. That what was unique about their nose became unique and really blown up about their nose, and so everything seemed to be failing. And it wasn't until I turned to artificial intelligence and the idea that had been used often in some feature films, but only in very complicated ways that would not be made possible for us. Looking at the idea of taking one person's face and lending it to the person, the protagonist in the film, and then what we started to develop with our VFX team was an algorithm that would do this for us in a programmatic way, so that it would not be a hands-on task, that it would really be mechanized. And that is, I think, the breakthrough that we arrived at. And what it allowed us to do, there are 23 people who are in the film whose anonymity was the kind of our highest challenge, like how to keep them safe. I promised everybody that I would work with them on the images that we were going to use and show them how we're doing this and get their sign off for security all along the way. And then we recruited from the community of activists 23 other people who lent their faces as an act of activism and allowed us to acquire the data of their face images in a week-long photo session. And that's what we used to build the algorithm that allowed us to map that new face over the old person in the film and truly transform them while doing nothing to change the actions or expressions in the film. And I think that was what was so shocking to me when we first saw it, and shocking certainly to the people in the film when I showed them, their life being expressed through somebody else's face, that it was really an emotionally true representation of those actions and those events. And Sam said, I don't like the phrase deep fake, and especially in this instance, because what the AI technique has allowed us to do is to bring out a kind of what otherwise would be a deep truth, right? A narrative, a story, an event, a series of crimes that couldn't be spoken about safely in any other way.
Really incredible. How did the people you were anonymizing react when they saw themselves expressed and voiced with these different faces?
It was really fascinating. What I did first was we did kind of a Photoshop to show what the one face would look like over the other, to get their agreement before we put it through this lengthy, months-long process of the amalgamation of those faces. And then I showed it to other people who were their friends and said, who is this? And to see if they could identify the person. And they couldn't. And so that was my kind of dry run before bringing it to the individuals and saying, this is what you're going to look like. It's just one frame, a still image. Is that going to be okay? And it was hard for them to understand how much that was going to transform their presentation in the film. But they signed off at that level. And then from there, we went into the lengthy process of face swapping. And that's what really, I think, blew people away. Everybody, to the last individual, laughed hysterically at seeing themselves wearing somebody else's face and going through a kind of, a similar path to what they went through. Grisha / Maxim, who's one of the principal people in the film, said it in some way it helped him emotionally process his own story, to watch it taking shape inside somebody else's skin in a way. And that was something I hadn't anticipated, the way that it might be kind of a passing along of the kind of trauma that so many of the people in the film have suffered. And I think that that's a little part of how everybody else has responded to it as well.
Amazing. I know that the shooting of this film was quite complex, considering the surveillance society in which you were operating. Can we just have a couple of minutes on some of the strategies that you used to get some of these incredibly candid shots? I mean, I've been through very airport checkpoints in very controlled societies as well, and you do not have cameras out. Cameras are regarded as, you know, military apparatus in many contexts where JHR works. How did you manage that?
That's very interesting. Well, I'm going to give credit to our cinematographer, Askol Kurov, who is a dissident filmmaker of significance in Russia. He has perfected a number of techniques. I don't feel like it will risk too much exposure to explain them to you. What we were shooting with mostly in airports was a Handycam, you know, a kind of a consumer tourist camera, which Askol carried. I'm going to do this with a little box here. He carried it under his arm like this, and all the lights were removed, so you couldn't tell that the camera was on. And he directed the camera through an app on his phone. So he was kind of turning his body and shifting and focusing and zooming, all while apparently, you know, being social media obsessed on his telephone. So he never took his eyes off his phone, and yet was able to capture incredibly intimate moments around him, and moments that you would not legally, you're right, be able to capture. I was the second camera and was operating my cell phone, and it is possible to take selfies and videos of your friends on your cell phone. That is not limited there. So I was just taking selfies like a crazy tourist. I had two phones with me, and when asked to produce my phone, which happened twice, to see what I had been shooting, I was able to give them the phone that I had been creating images on, just for that, in case that happened. So we were creating a kind of a false narrative inside one of the cell phones for that.
And you had an interesting alibi, if I understand correctly, that you were following your soccer hero.
Well, when we went to Chechnya, that was with my cell phone and a hidden camera, a GoPro that was hidden inside a pack. And because we didn't want to have anything that looked like a camera at all. And in Chechnya, I knew that we all knew that I would stand out. So we decided that I should stand out in a grand way. And my cover story was that I had hired these two folks to take me on a tour of Chechnya, because I was a soccer fan, a football fan, and especially of the Egyptian football team, which had just traveled through there. So that was my excuse, my cover story, and we had gone to many of the places where they had gone, and filled this second kind of tourist phone with those images. And we were detained there, and the phone was requested there, and those images were discussed there, and it was just it just worked. The cover story worked, and I'm a person who knows nothing about sports in any way. So if they had Googled me, I think everything would have fallen apart immediately. But it worked, and each one of our missions, each one of our filming missions and scenes and extractions involved a separate cover story, all geared toward the very specifics of what we were going to do in that period.
Thank you for that. I hope that helps the audience understand the level of personal risk that you were also running in making this documentary. Kimahli, on that theme of sort of on-the-ground logistics, can you just share a little bit about specifically how you were working with these incredibly courageous activists on the ground in Chechnya, how you've been working with them? You're on mute.
This is going to be a running joke of our society. You're on mute. I think we all look forward to when we don't have to say that as often. I was saying to you, no, I actually can't tell you that. I can't answer that question, just for security reasons, but I will try. So I say there are a couple aspects to the intervention in Chechnya. One was, there, just to pinpoint the danger that folks were in. The detention of folks was really swift and immediate, and people were being rounded up in their homes, place of work. Others tortured for multiple weeks. And I think that the real pinpoint was at the end of their detention. Before they were released, they were outed to their families and communities, and that was the real. So there were two aspects of danger of people fleeing. One, folks who were already detained and outed, and really kind of instructed by the police force to their families to kill their children, or nieces, nephews, etc. And then there was the other people who heard that this was happening and were next. A big part of the campaign was to entrap folks by social media networks, get their information, and then ask them while they were tortured to give them names of more LGBTQI people. So I mentioned that because the terror aspect here is kind of the most crucial to zero in on and understand. And so people had to either flee that situation so they won't be next, or they were already detained and fearful of being detained again. And so there were two aspects of the relocation efforts. One was, which was really remarkably captured in the film, was just people getting out to Chechnya, to neighboring places within Russia and numerous cities, so that they can just hide out. And so it wasn't clear for us at Rainbow Railroad. We get requests from multiple countries, from individuals one-on-one, and to work in something so complex as far as multiple people at one time, it wasn't really clear at the beginning how long people were detained, the sources of detention. We can't get people out of prisons, for example, if they were stuck in there. But it was understanding that our partners on the ground had established a network, a way for people to get out and get into hiding. That was really key and crucial. Once we understood that if we could support those safe houses, that we could further engage and work with governments to get them out further, then we'd have the key to interventions. And so that's what we were able to do. Making sure those safe houses were secure. As you can imagine, the security threat at the safe houses were high. They had to be relocated more than once, and making sure that we had access to the people at risk so they can then relocate safely to other countries was key.
Wow. And mindful that this session is sponsored by Global Affairs Canada, what could the Canadian government or Canadian civil society do more of or differently to better help you in your work?
Yeah. So this has been an interesting week for me personally. I was engaged in a conversation with UN agencies just earlier today, and with the U.S. government earlier this week, where we also work, in which and a week ago and I'll get to Canada in a second, but in a week ago, after much fanfare of the Biden administration making a historical memo on LGBTQI rights, which explicitly mentions refugees. One of the things that David captures at the very end of the film is noting that the U.S. did not receive any Chechen refugees, and Canada did. And the Biden administration, in mentioning LGBTQI refugees in their memo, pledged to increase refugee resettlement from a low of 15,000 over the past 4 years to 125,000. And then just last week, threatened to renege on that. It was reported that they were going to renege on that and go back to Trump-era caps, which was denounced by civil society, including ourselves. I mentioned that in the Canadian context because we're not doing enough globally. As I said, there are 80 million displaced people, and Canada sometimes uses the fact that it's doing a lot of good work on refugee protection to deflect the fact that we're not doing enough. You know, Canada resettled the most amount of refugees over the past 4 years, but 20,000 people is not enough to really tackle the problem. And specifically in cases like the situation in Chechnya and other crises, we're very reactive. Even our really important intervention in Syria most recently is a reactive policy. And so our argument to the Canadian government is that we need more clear tools to respond to these crises as they happen, so that we're not scrambling for a response or for a response. Unfortunately, because these situations happen often. Just recently in Ghana, there was a raid in the LGBTQI center where a number of people that we're supporting had to flee and are currently in hiding right now. And there's not a clear mechanism by which we can have referral status with the government of Canada to identify these people and say they're at risk. We're getting there. In the last government, the Minister of Immigration, specifically in a mandate, created a human rights defender stream, a refugee stream for human rights defenders, journalists, and humanitarian workers for up to 250 slots per year. Our explicit ask to the Canadian government is to identify LGBTQI human rights defenders as a group of concern, and ensure that people can flee from their country of which they're being persecuted. And the last thing that can really help in situations like Chechnya is to identify Rainbow Railroad as an organization that has the expertise and the network to support these efforts. We now receive over 3,000 requests of help per year. It's likely going to be up to 4,000 this year. We triage. If you can imagine, I have a colleague who themselves is a survivor and asylum seeker who has the job right now in COVID at their home of triaging every single case. So we have the skills and the know-how to do this work, and the government of Canada needs to work with us.
That's a great message to have and to hear, and hopefully Global Affairs is listening, considering the extent of the need. And I know that they are doing good work, and I know that Dignity Network has been doing great work as well, which I know you're a part of. But there is a real urgency to this issue. We see it everywhere we work in Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in the Middle East. So hopefully we can see some more traction as a result of this session and others.
Can I just add one more thing? Just on a personal note, to David's comment earlier around just the AI aspect. I had met Maxime in person while he was in hiding, and I know the story really well. I was there in it, and it was remarkable watching. I think there's in general, when we talk about documentary film, and I'm not a documentary filmmaker, I'm just a consumer, but as a as a activist and as a working in human rights, I'm always kind of nervous about the fear of exploitation with film. And it's funny, it just occurs to me till now, I didn't even think when I saw it with an audience, watching Maxime and I didn't think about it once. And I think that's the most remarkable thing about watching the film as someone who was a consumer, just how easy it was to not focus on the fact that they were obscured. It leads to an interesting question that if it wasn't for the talking about how remarkable the AI was, you could have just presented this film and no one would have noticed that they would have thought the activists were the people who were in the film. So I guess just a testament to what a remarkable feat this was.
Yeah, it is a truly remarkable feat of cinematic engineering. And again, as I say, watch the movie if you haven't yet. Welcome to Chechnya. I'm going to turn the conversation to Sam now. And Sam, if you can share a little bit more about your work with this kind of technology and how that work has evolved over the past few years as the technology has evolved.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just, I want to add a little bit of context around kind of the people who need this type of technology and the growing diversity and range of people who face the need to be anonymous. And I think one of the big trends in Witness's work over the last 20 years, and we've been around for 30 years, is of course that many more people film human rights footage and many more people are captured in human rights footage. And that includes very deliberate witnesses, it includes longtime activists, and it includes vulnerable bystanders and community members. And we have, in some sense, a paradox in human rights documentation that many more people can do it, and at the same time, they can place many more people at risk. And the tools have not kept up to this, right? That most people, and that we found this when we first started developing tools for AI-based and non-AI-based blurring, that it was kind of shocking. I remember that when we first started doing this, it was during the Syrian protests in 2011, and we were hearing from people we were working with that they had done very crude blurring of faces from people in protests, or they had not been able to blur it on a mobile phone before they went through a checkpoint and someone checked their phone, or they were trying to do it on a desktop, but really that was crazy because most people were using mobile devices or cameras. And so there is this big gap that we've seen between many more people filming and the capacity to do things like literally even just blur a face, let alone get to the stage that we're describing with the tools that David and his colleagues developed. So a lot of our work, of course, is actually about how you just avoid showing faces and avoid doing this, because that's what you really need to do now, and raising the awareness around it. And then the other dimension that's sort of contextually that I think is really important to think about now is, of course, that the safety and security implications of advances in AI, of advances in facial recognition mean that, the single time that someone speaks out, the single time that someone takes the courage to be visible can follow them their whole lives and be correlated via their face print, or frankly, less high technically by people tracking them down using, online, what the horrible phrase we've heard in originally coming out of China of human flesh search engines, this ability that you can track people down. If you share their face to enough people, someone will recognize them. And so we are in this quandary of how do we support many more people who document at the same time as recognizing these real challenges that come from governments and hostile societies and from advancing AI and other technologies. And, an example we're seeing that play out right now would be Myanmar, right, where you have many more people suddenly coming into the streets to protest the coup that has taken place by the military there. At the same time, we know that Myanmar military intelligence is sophisticated, has access to tools and all of these things. So this is the context that we place all of this in. And over the last few years, we've been really working on the use of AI for in these so-called deepfakes, these ability to better in inverted commas manipulate to make it look like someone said or did something they never did, or to create a scene that never happened. And I want to talk about the concerns about that first, because I think it's really hard, honestly, to find a sort of balancing act between the good uses and the bad there. There are a whole host of negative usages happening from parallel technologies to what David and his team used. They're primarily used at the moment to target women with non-consensual sexual images. For example, someone will take a image of someone's face and place it on a sex industry actress's body, and that's of course both stealing the consent from the sex industry actress or their bodily integrity, and it's also of course taking away consent and agency from the person whose face is placed in it. So that is very prevalent as a harm now, and we've started to see other examples where people are falsifying scenes and images, and we did this series of global meetings really trying to move this discussion away from being US-centric, European-centric, by bringing people who had lived experience of similar problems of protecting their identity, protecting their reputation, facing mis and disinformation in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. And, generally people saw this as a negative trend. Where they did see some positive possibility was exactly in what we're seeing David and the team describing here, which was people want the opportunity to share their story in public. They want to do that in some settings with more anonymity and some without, right? Like this is not as on-off, you live all your life in anonymity, some without anonymity. You want to be visible, sometimes anonymous, other times depending on context. So people said that they wanted to be able to use tools like deepfakery or deepfakes to protect their identity when they need it, but retain this sense of humanity. At the same time as they were intensely conscious that even when they went out there with their real face, of the possibility of face theft, right? So the way these tools are built to create fake individuals is to use training data of real individuals. So in this case, David and his team borrowed the faces from activists who wanted to be substituted in, but you can gather the data of anyone's face and put it in. So a lot of people said, look, I want to have tools that are about my ability to anonymize my face with something like this. I also want tools to opt out of someone stealing my face, right? Ways in which someone can not steal my face and then use it. Because their other fear is, of course, that governments and hostile forces will take their face and place them in a hostile setting, right? So to imply that they are corrupt or they've committed some kind of crime. Or indeed, and we saw this, when people have lived in contexts where there are confession videos or forced confessions, that they will be placed in a forced confession or some kind of statement that will compromise them. So this is an intensely complicated area. I love what Welcome to Chechnya did, because it somehow treads this incredible line between doing this incredibly technically well, like this is a masterpiece of doing it technically well, knowing this space, but also not playing into people's fear that you can fake everything, because I love that sort of the halos that the individuals in the film have. So you can actually tell that they've been face swapped or deep truthed. And so you're not trying to confuse people into like believing that this is completely real. And that's really important, because people are also talking about this worry that the prevalence of deepfakes makes people believe they can't believe anything. That everything could be faked. And we need to challenge that, because that then gets used by authoritarians and governments to say, look, you can't believe anything. Those civic journalists, those activists, they could have been faked. So the film really treads a fine line also in respecting this really big challenge area we've heard around what's called the liar's dividend, the ability to claim everything's fake, and how that's being used against activists.
Mm.
I wonder whether Journalists for Human Rights is currently doing training with journalists, training them on how to identify fake information, disinformation, misinformation, some very basic strategies to be able to understand and fact check information coming to them, in particular online. I'm wondering if Witness had, I know you guys have done a work on disinformation and misinformation as well, and this issue of deep fakes. I've seen news telecasts that have been entirely faked in different environments. Strategies or ideas or guidance you might provide to journalists who might be watching this, or those who consume the news, as ways you can identify deep fakes and protect your understanding of what you're seeing online?
Yeah, so this has been an area that people are increasingly coming to us and asking, how do we do this? And I think there's two layers to this. One is we've produced training materials that help people think about deepfakes and also what we describe as shallow fakes, so just simpler edits or miscontextualized media. And in fact, our top line guidance on all of this is not to go down a kind of like, I'm trying to detect it with media forensics rabbit hole, partly because most journalists and most civil society don't have the ability to do that well, right? They don't have the forensic tools. And instead, there's actually a sort of simple methodology we borrow from media literacy experts in the US called SIFT, which is stop, investigate the source, find alternative coverage, and trace the original content. And this is basically a way of saying, actually, for many fakes, you don't want to try and work out if it's been manipulated by looking, intensely at every pixel. You want to try and think, Are there other ways I could understand this piece of information? Has it come from a manipulation of an original piece of footage, which is often true, of course, of deepfakes? And the reason we're saying that as well is that there are real challenges in the availability of good deepfake detection tools. One of the things we heard very clearly in all these meetings we held globally was journalists, particularly globally, saying, we're pretty willing to bet that detection tools will be made available to the BBC and CBC Canada and the New York Times, but not to community journalists in Rio or human rights groups in the Caucasus or a major news outlet perhaps in Southeast Asia. And so we're not expecting to get these tools provided to us, nor do we have the skills. And the other thing is those tools are often pretty unreliable. So, as I said, David and his team give a really good hint that these are deep fakes in their in the film because they provide these halos. And those halos reminded me of what happened in a recent incident in Myanmar that is controversial. There was a video released by the government that appeared to show a senior politician admitting to corruption involving the de facto Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi. People in Myanmar put it through an online deepfakes detector, and the deepfake detector has one of those like boxes around their heads that says like it's a 95% chance this is a deepfake. The problem is that deepfake detector is probably wrong, right? So it's a detector that's giving an erroneous response, probably because the video is low resolution, because it may be a technique of generation that detector doesn't know well, because the person is under stress and doesn't speak in the normal way. And suddenly everyone thinks that there are these deepfakes being used against them. So we're in a real bind. We want to be really careful about telling people to detect this with media forensics. Instead, I think for ordinary consumers as well, including people watching this who are worried about deepfakes, it's better to start with basic media literacy principles.
Yeah, no, that's very much the spirit of our training as well. Interesting. David, did you have any concerns about the way you were using AI in the film as you were going through?
Apologies for my dog, who's just seen something exciting out the window. I wanted to pick up on what Sam was talking about. We felt it was very essential for us to make sure that everybody involved in this process was consenting. So that meant that the people we were disguising understood what we were doing and were consenting along the way. We were calling it informed consent. So at every step that they were there as a partner with us in approving their images. And the same was true with the activists who lent us their faces. But the final step for us was to make sure that the audience understood what was happening. And that's why we put those halos around the faces. What we discovered is that it would be possible to do this, use this technique invisibly, so that the audience would not have any sense of it. And that did make us very nervous. We entered into long debates about what that would mean for the story, what that would mean for the journalism that was involved in the film, and what that would mean for the audience themselves. So you talk about deepfake filters or detectors. I think we could have finished this film in a way that would not have been detected, and that's, of course, the worrisome part. And I think that it's the obligation of people who are using these kind of morally questionable or challenging technologies to use them in ways that are ethical. And I think what we proved in the film is that it is possible to use this face swapping in an ethical way. But for us, it was not an easy step to make, and something that we really challenged ourselves about over and over.
And I have to ask, the people who lent their faces, were there any repercussions for them, or what was the situation for them once the film came out?
There has not been repercussions. They're mostly New York based, so they're not people who are frequently traveling through the Caucasus, and they are, for the most part, as I said, activists themselves who are already using their faces in public protests to decry what's happening in Chechnya and especially around LGBTQ immigration issues globally. And so for them, this was an extension of that work. I was in a room at one point where the young woman who lent her face as a shield to protect Anya, one of the women in the film, when she walked into a room in which there were many activists, it was in the United States. There was no risk, seemingly, of her being in any trouble, but people were really shocked that Anya had suddenly shown up in Utah, of all places. And because at the end of the film, we say that her whereabouts was unknown. And that really, like, people's hearts stopped when that happened. And I think that's the only time that the American individual's presence has kind of crossed into the reality of what's happening.
I had to ask. We often confront situations where we're asking ourselves if the stories that Journalists for Human Rights is helping to produce, are we in the process of producing these stories actually creating more harms? And we work hard to mitigate against that. And I figured there were strategies in place, but just wanted to probe that a little bit more. Sam, I'm wondering if you could share on the positive side of using this technology. One of the challenges of getting people to testify or bear witness to human rights atrocities is actually getting them to be comfortable that there won't be repercussions or retribution as a result of stepping forward. What do you think? What's the potential to help to address that problem with this kind of technology?
I think when people step forward, and David has been describing it very eloquently, that it's people, there's a mix of people want to tell their story and they want to feel complete in doing that, right? And there's been historically, and as I said, most of the tools we've worked with have been ones that involve blurring or hiding people's face, that classic, you just film someone's hands, or you've filmed them, in silhouette. And all of these in some way do take away from the story, particularly when you're trying to tell it over a longer narrative arc of those journeys versus just a very short interview where it's almost utilitarian. So, the tremendous possibility of these AI tools is the ability to maintain this humanization, to make people feel that they're integrally telling their story, but that you're removing, in some sense, the risk. Now, of course, in all our work around this and in all our training around this, you always remind people that it's really not just about the face, right? Like that you can identify someone by their location, by their characteristic clothing, by their context, by timing, by the presence of the filmmaker, right? So we have to be very cautious that we don't over-center just the face. And I know this is part of the practice, I'm sure, of what happened in Welcome to Chechnya, of really thinking about context and using that as well. But there's tremendous potential in this. And I think, one thing to note is, of course, most of these types of tools are relatively inaccessible to most human rights activists right now. One encouraging thing, and on David's team, Ryan Laney, who worked on the visual effects, has been really interested in trying to think how to make the sort of the pipeline of this less labor intensive, more available to human rights journalists and documenters. And I think, if we look at the technological trends in this synthetic media landscape, it is getting easier, and of course, easier for the malicious usages, but also easier for these really positive usages, and including also things like, disguising someone's voice in a way that might still retain some elements of their, of them. So I think, again, there are these sort of parallel trajectories of the negative and the positive uses. Very much on the positive side, the popularization of this for human rights usages. And this is where I think, and again, as we look at kind of the role of governments, and as well as within the tech industry, as we need to think, what are the norms about what you let people do with these tools? What do you forbid when people have the apps that can do this? And increasingly apps can do these things. What do you not make possible in your tools? And then ultimately what governments regulate around, and where we've seen this most visibly has been around non-consensual sexual images being used. But I think this is a moment for governments to both support, norms, and for people within the filmmaking industry and within human rights to say, what do we think are the norms around usages? And then, to look to, governments who've been historically supportive of well-balanced regulation like Canada to be playing a role in making good decisions around AI-generated synthetic media.
You make an interesting point, Sam, that I wanted to jump in on, and that's that the face is not the only reflection of an individual's personality and uniqueness. And we did also change voices, and we did also change clothing. And in a number of instances, we changed hair. So, and those are much more traditional uses of kind of movie making technologies. But also equally essential in disguising people. We removed jewelry, we added jewelry. We were trying to throw people off the scent of who these individuals were in ways that didn't change their narratives or their stories, but continued to offer them the kind of protection that they needed.
Wonderful. Well, it's an incredible piece of documentary filmmaking, and I do encourage everyone who's on this webinar to check it out. Welcome to Chechnya, HBO in the US, Crave in Canada. Thank you all for your time and your insights on these urgent human rights issues in Chechnya affecting sexual minorities. I am going to pass it back to Kyle to close us out. Thank you so much.
Just want to say thank you, everyone. Rachel, you did an amazing job moderating this discussion. David, your film is powerful, and you've showed everyone watching what can be used to actually bring human rights abuses to the forefront through documentary film, and how AI can be used to protect human rights activists. Sorry, I have my screen seems a bit blocked right now, and I just want to thank our other panelists for joining us. This is a fascinating discussion, and it's the end of the AI and Human Rights Forum. As I said, we're gonna make this video available online so other people can watch it. We're gonna share with it, and we're gonna turn this into an annual event. So once again, I want to thank Rachel, David, Sam, and Kimahli. Thank you for joining us, and keep up the important work that you're doing.